Hi, my name is David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures podcast. How do we make housing more affordable? If multifamily housing is at least part of that answer, how do we make it less crappy and more desirable for people and families to live in? This is something Seattle architect Michael Eliason has wrestled with for years. He founded Larch Labs, a firm dedicated to not only building appealing and affordable housing, but also doing it sustainably. He spent time in Freiburg, Germany, a renowned sustainable city, and he's attempting to live the vision of a high-quality, denser, more sustainable lifestyle in Seattle. Edmonton and Calgary are two of the most sprawling cities in North America. So, learning how to build a more compact city that makes better use of expensive infrastructure and produces a lot fewer emissions is a laudable goal. But getting there is a more difficult journey. The key is, how do we build denser in a way that people actually like it and benefit from affordability gains? As part of the ongoing discussion around new zoning bylaws in Edmonton, Councillor Michael Jans of Edmonton City Council invited the Seattle architect to come and speak in Edmonton about his ideas for building sustainable buildings and sustainable neighborhoods. Here's our full 38-minute interview with Michael Eliason.
Hi, my name is Michael Eliason. I'm an architect based in Seattle. Spent a couple of years working in Germany and founded the firm Larch Lab 2 years ago. We're focused on decarbonized buildings, low-car, transit-accessible neighborhoods, and very efficient, community-oriented housing.
You're coming from your lovely, I'm sure you have a lovely home in Seattle, Washington, to Edmonton, Alberta to speak. What's your main message? What are you coming to say?
My main message, I think, based on my conversation with Michael, is really the way that we're living is incredibly unsustainable, that we can build a future with abundant housing, very walkable and accessible neighborhoods, more affordable housing, housing with a higher quality of life, and housing in neighborhoods that are more climate adaptive as well.
So why do we need to do this? What's the big problem we're trying to solve?
I think at this point, there are several kind of competing or conflicting things that we need to start addressing. One is the housing crisis. The housing crisis in the U.S. is starting to get really severe. My understanding is in parts of Canada, it's also getting quite severe. People my age or even younger have very much few opportunities to buy housing, to attain housing. Rental housing costs are exploding kind of everywhere. So there's the housing issue is one thing that we need to start addressing. And then contrasted with that is also the climate crisis, which is in weird ways also exacerbating the housing crisis. So in the U.S., we've had entire cities that have gone, have been destroyed by wildfire. Those people are now homeless or exacerbating housing conditions in other places. But it's also about how are we going to live in a world where wildfire is extremely rampant. You guys in Alberta have had, I think, a little over a month now of wildfire. It's very early in the season. My parents live in Washington, D.C. I have family and friends in Philadelphia and New York. And, their situation, I guess that was last week, is also pretty dire, and just how toxic the air is becoming. And so I think we're going to need to start pivoting to build buildings that are more adaptive to not just smoke events, but heat events. Deluges from rainfalls are now just, the amount of water falling out of clouds is higher than it's ever been. So I think we really need to start pivoting to addressing both of these things, and we need to do it in a fairly rapid manner. Whether or not you believe in climate change, like this is stuff that's happening. These things are getting worse, and we need to start figuring out ways to kind of adapt to them.
Well, it's definitely weird where I'm from, which is in central Alberta, because we've had a number of years now of very, very dry springs with major fire events. And now, as of today, we have a rain warning.
Yeah, no, the duality of it is really weird, right? Like we were anticipating getting some of the smoke, over the last couple of weeks from Canada, and nothing panned out. And we normally go camping on this weekend. This is kind of the weekend where, this last weekend where school lets out, and we do a 3-day bike camping event with a bunch of friends. And normally it's hot. Over the years, it's gotten increasingly hotter. And then this year it was 50 degrees and rainy. So it's, I guess it's one of those things where climate and weather are really two different things, right? It's climate and weather can inform climate, but climate is kind of the long-term things, and weather is the day-to-day ins and outs. And so there is going to be wild variation. And you see this with, the heat dome. 2 weeks before the heat dome hit us in the Pacific Northwest, it was very mild, very cool, and then boom, out of nowhere, it just, the heat just exploded, and it had, very extreme effects, including, I think, about 1,000 deaths.
Well, I know it doesn't sound bad to you because of the units issue, but it was the first time I experienced 37 degrees at my home, but that's Celsius. Just before we get to some of your ideas and some of the solutions, what are the biggest problems we're trying to solve with our urban development strategies? I've heard it said that with no deference to your profession, the greatest architect of cities has been the car. Is that, what's the biggest problem been with our urban development strategy? I mean, we've talked about this for a long time, phrases like urban sprawl, whatever, but what's the biggest problem with traditional strategies?
I think it does come down to the car and trying to accommodate the car, which is a very large, spatially inefficient object in a city where things are better to be closer together, more walkable. It really affects like so many issues. It affects climate, safe streets, quality of life, right? There's noise pollution, there's air pollution affiliated with the car. So it's really about rethinking, I think, our relationship with the car. So I'm not advocating for people to ditch their cars or to go completely car free. We don't own a car, and so we know the difficulties. We have 2 kids, they're in sports, of what that entails. But I think that having lived and worked in both Germany and the US, I think that there are opportunities and ways to enable a more car light lifestyle. And I also think that with where mobility is going in the next 5 to 10 years, we may see better opportunities for living either without a car or some kind of car share where you don't need it all the time, but you can have access to one as well.
So you talk in particular. Let's talk about the urban design aspects of this, not the actual buildings. You talk in particular about a couple of strategies to do this thing better. Talk about your strategies.
So I think there's a couple of things. One is the way that we build in the U.S. for unit access and Canada as well. Canada is actually a little bit worse than the U.S. in this. Is radically different from the rest of the world, way the rest of the world builds. So kind of your typical urban housing in Europe, even in South America, parts of Asia, is going to be a single stair building. This is a building with a small number of units kind of clustered around an elevator and stair core. And what they can do is that they can kind of take that core with the units around it and then keep repeating it over and over and over again. And what this does is a couple of things. It introduces units where you can have daylight on multiple sides. So if you think about what almost all new development in the US and Canada looks like, it's these very large buildings, very hotel-like. There'll be a corridor down the middle, units on either side. Those units generally only have windows on one side. It's very difficult to get family-sized units in those. In places like Seattle and San Francisco, the building codes and the zoning codes really work to only induce studios and 1-bedroom units in these buildings, right? So if you want to do a 3-bedroom unit, it's economically competing with the income that would come from 3 or 4 different studios. And so there's some weird cost things happening. It induces buildings that are not climate adaptive. So there's no opportunities for cross ventilation. We position a lot of our buildings on loud streets. So if you're on that street, you can't get away from the noise. Your bedroom is on that side of the building. With the way that they plan in other countries, you can put those bedrooms on the quieter side of the building because you have, that dual aspect. You have windows on both the street side and the courtyard side, if you will, of the building. There are also other kind of knock-on effects around air pollution, and it sort of induces these much thicker buildings as well than you see in other countries. So I have this pamphlet. It's a German pamphlet from I think about 20 years ago, talking about extreme building depths, and it's 17 to 20 meters. This is about 60 feet. In the U.S. now in Seattle, we have double-loaded corridors where just one studio unit can be approaching 50 or 60 feet. So then if you have a hallway and then another studio of the same side, you're talking about a building that is over twice as wide as like an extreme depth in other countries. So it's kind of all of these weird knock-on effects that occur from this one issue. It means that we have less kind of open space in our buildings. There's less opportunity for blue-green infrastructure, less space for trees. And so it's a really odd way of kind of developing. I think part of it is an overreaction to where building codes were in the 1930s. There were a series of fire events in places like New York City. We didn't have sprinklers at the time. It was really a way of kind of mitigating some of those issues. But over time, our building materials, we've gotten much better about how we deal with fire in buildings. I was just going to say that it was based on kind of some weird history, but we have sprinklers now. We have better fire-rated materials. We understand how fire operates in buildings, and we have better approaches for dealing with fires in buildings and fighting fires and stuff at this point. So it's interesting to me that all of these things have changed, but we haven't changed this fundamental difference in our building code, which is a radical departure from kind of the rest of the world.
So what you're saying is the multifamily that we've built has been crappy.
I would say, yeah, the quality of life of the multifamily housing that we're generally building in the U.S. And I think Canada is actually better than the U.S., but it's not as great as it could be.
Oh, you don't have to be nice. You talk about something called point access blocks. Is that something you're going to talk about when you come to town? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so the point access block is it's a single stair building. It's really just, I think, a way of planning buildings, of developing buildings that allows for more flexibility, more variability, more climate adaptation. It induces larger units, so it's more family friendly as well. And then one of the things that I love about this is, I've lived in a building that's a double loaded corridor, kind of the typical form of construction, with 40 units on one floor. Most of them are studios. It's really difficult to know anybody on that building. But the point access blocks are much more compact. It's difficult to get 40 people in a building vertically, and maybe you only have like 2 or 4 households per floor. And so it's really easy to get to know your neighbors. There are, I think, a lot of interesting opportunities around community-oriented development. It's kind of the typical form of Baugruppen, which are kind of self-developed urban co-housing in Germany. And yeah, so I will be talking about this at the event on the 29th.
Great. So what about the experience around these buildings, like the neighborhood you build these in? What does that need to look like?
I think it doesn't have to look a specific way. So when I think about point access blocks in the Germany or Switzerland or Austria or countries like that, they could be dense urban buildings, kind of infill, or a large perimeter block, kind of like if you think of downtown Barcelona, Example, or kind of the older cores of cities. They work in those neighborhoods, but they also work in kind of the more suburban areas on the outskirts of those cities. So it's like a threeplex of stacked flats, or a sixplex with 2 units on each floor around a central stair, and then ample space around it and space for trees, car parking if you need it. So it isn't really it doesn't really induce a certain look. It does allow kind of a lot of flexibility. But one of the things that I think that it does so well is it allows for more housing on smaller lots, and so you don't have to assemble these huge parcels to do this massive development. You can start to do these smaller kind of little infill projects in the city, kind of maybe in the outskirts of the city, downtown. There's a lot of flexibility that comes on with that.
So who's doing this well? Do you have some good examples, and are they from this continent?
Actually, there are. It's a fairly common way of developing in Mexico. So there are some really elegant examples in Mexico City that are also rooted in kind of the way that they deal with climate. So incorporating courtyards and ways of purging the heat and shade protection and all of that as well. In the U.S., these are legal almost everywhere up to 3 stories. The issue is we don't require elevators for buildings under 4 stories. So in most of the U.S., these buildings want to have an elevator. There would be maybe 1 or 2 units on the ground floor that would be accessible. In Seattle and New York City, we can go to 6 stories. This induces more accessible units. They're using elevators. It allows more intensity on certain lots. There are a number of really interesting projects here in the U.S. There's a wonderful co-housing project here in Seattle by Schemata Architects that kind of is almost rooted in more of what I would think of as how you would dwell in like Spain or LA, where it's a very narrow infill lot, and they have a building on the front and a building on the back, and this wonderful courtyard where all of the units kind of open onto. In COVID, it was this place where people could get together, the kids could play, they could celebrate birthdays and special events, and it really kind of induced like this magical community. But beyond that, there really aren't that many opportunities. Like I said, it's not legal in most of the U.S. above 3 stories. In Canada, you're limited to 2 stories. So there aren't a lot of models to really show what this could look like without going to other places where you would see it.
Interesting. So, what about the buildings themselves? I know you think about that, and you're thinking about climate resilience. You're thinking about mitigation. What about the buildings themselves? How do we do those better?
For me, the big one is like we should be thinking about how to mitigate wildfire smoke, heat events, cold snaps. Passive house isn't the magic key for all of this, but it is really good at mitigating a bunch of these. The buildings are airtight. They use heat recovery ventilators, which is a ventilation system. You can pre-filter it to keep the smoke out. So that's one way of dealing with the smoke. It's not standard anywhere in the U.S. yet. It becomes standard in parts of Massachusetts in 2024. I'm on a social housing developer PDA. I'm a board member here in Seattle. We've decided that all of our buildings have to be either new built to passive house or retrofitted to passive house. Really, this is kind of thinking about how we're going to be building in 10 years anyway. So our energy codes, and my understanding from British Columbia and a couple of other, I think Ontario's energy codes, they incrementally step better, right? And so really this is about building the way that we should have been building 10 years ago, but we won't be building in 10 years. It's really about doing this now. And so passive house is a big one. I'm a big proponent of decarbonized buildings. So utilizing materials that are fiber-based or natural elements, cellulose insulation. You can make insulation out of wood fiber, getting foam out of our buildings, plastics out of our buildings, using less concrete. Mass timber is a big potential win there as well. But there are trade-offs. It's the Potsdam Institute for Climate. I think this was earlier this year, had a report on, there's this balance. We can build entire cities out of mass timber, but we do need to ensure that we're building places where the wood can grow, that we're harvesting it in a sustainable way. This issue about sustainable wood harvesting it's been an ongoing debate my entire life that I can recall. So it is one that is of importance.
We have a really interesting example that just opened the other day right here in Edmonton. The Salvation Army, of all organizations, just built a 175 unit complex, this timber. Number one, I think it's 4 stories or something like that. And it's at the last minute, they requoted the project. They were going to go for code built. And at the last minute, they requoted the project, issued new RFPs, and they wound up building geothermal heated with GeoExchange, with very thick walls, like 10-inch thick walls, super insulated, good air filtering and air control. And in fact, they hadn't spec'd air conditioning in the building originally. And then they too were inspired by the heat dome to think about, whoa, like maybe we need to think about this, which would have been very expensive the conventional way. They wound up spending only 1% to 2% more and are going to save $250 a year on utilities alone. They figure they're going to save $6 million on this project. So this is the worst case scenario. Edmonton is the most northerly big city in North America and in the whole continent. If we can do it here, they can do it anywhere. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
I think so. I've been involved with Passive House since 2010. In the beginning, we didn't have the know-how. Everyone was kind of winging it. We had some support from Germany, but like all of the products were really coming out of Europe. There weren't a lot of like window manufacturers that could do passive house rated windows here in the US. Our industries weren't really aligned for it as well. Since then, developers, builders, architects, engineers have become much more competent with it. We're seeing buildings that are in the range of, they actually are coming in under budget to maybe 1% to 2% over. So there is this trend line where it is tracking down pretty dramatically. And I think the biggest key is just having people who know what they're doing and having passive house as the goal from the beginning, so that you can have a smaller air conditioner if you have to add it in the end. Like I said, the climate adaptation component of it, of how we build, I think needs to be a much larger conversation. We are starting to heavily subsidize heat pumps and heat pump hot water systems in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that we're only going to start to see more of an effort. We need solar protection. When I lived in Germany, we had exterior shades on every window and even skylights. It's like an industry that doesn't exist at all in the US. It's really difficult to get them. Maybe you could have some sale company manufacture some, or you could invest in some operable shutters like you would have seen in a house from 120 years ago, some wood that you fold open and close. I'm hoping that with the IRA, we start to see a lot more investment in that. There's an organization in Maine that is taking wood byproduct, the fiber, and turning that into insulation that'll be used on a number of low energy buildings like Passive House. So I think that we're starting to see that industry change here, but we are still 15 to 20 years behind the EU in some of these technologies.
Well, it seems to me technically we can do it. We know how to do it. Technically, it can be done. Right now, I think the limiting factor is the experience of the architects, the builders, some of the ones that are confident, they'll get you that par price or that 1 or 2% surplus for something that's going to save you a ton of money. The other guys who are not that confident are not sure yet because they haven't had the experience. So I think we're at a turning point, I suspect. I don't want to go there. Let's move on. As much as I'd love to, that's one of my favorite areas. But I want to talk about the social aspect of this. You're coming from Seattle, which is kind of like our Vancouver. You guys are very hip. You're into multifamily probably a little more than cities on the prairies. And Edmonton and Calgary in Alberta are notably, I think, the most sprawling cities in North America. We're big cities, lots of space. So how do you bring the message of multifamily here and densification, which is what our city's wrestling with right now, and why you're coming to town? How do you have that discussion socially? What are we doing with that aspect?
So I would say that this is an issue that Edmonton is not alone in. This is an issue that almost every city in North America, with the exception of maybe New York City and a couple of others, are really having. I mean, even I think like 80% of Vancouver is detached houses. Seattle, it's about 75% of our land area where housing is allowed as well. So this is a very common issue throughout North America. For me, I think it's the cost of housing one, and accessibility is a huge one, right? So we can't afford to buy a detached house in Seattle. We're effectively priced out. And the suburbs are not any cheaper anymore. The suburbs are actually becoming more expensive than Seattle for a number of reasons. So it's not like we can just pick up and move to an adjacent suburb if we wanted to stay here. So we need to start thinking about how we can pool our resources, how we can live in maybe a more compact place, and just, if we want to stay here, what are the give and takes of that? One of the reasons that I think multifamily housing can be greater is, if we're taking these issues around climate adaptation and quality of life into account, that's going to be huge in helping the promotion of it, or the maybe the accessibility of the public. But for me, and this is a big reason that we focus on Baugruppe and it's kind of the self-developed urban co-housing, is that community aspect is central to it. We're designing the building with the people who are going to be living in it. We're going to be neighbors. It's a kind of a way of getting to know everyone in our building, or at least some of the people who are founding it. As populations age, and I have parents who are aging, so this is something that I'm thinking about as well. How are they going to be able to remain in their housing? So if we build a new multifamily house that is accessible and has a variety of units, and it has, let's say, a guest suite, that guest suite can become a caretaker's facility. If an elderly resident or any resident really needs a live-in caretaker for that period of time, there's some flexibility in that too. It could also become a place where, if there's a teenager who doesn't want to live in their small house with their family, it could become like a teenager suite. And they're still within the building, they're still within that community, but they have kind of their own space where they can kind of mature and grow into an adult. With COVID, it could become, or future pandemics, which I'm sure we'll see more of, it could become an isolation ward. So it's really about kind of accommodating the flexibility of needs and uses as a larger group would allow. But so much of the way that we develop multifamily housing, it's not really conducive to those sorts of adaptations. Units are generally all small here in the U.S. Like in Seattle, it's really difficult to get the economics of family-sized units to pencil. But like in Germany, a Baugruppe would have a variety of unit sizes, small studios all the way up to 3 or 4 bedroom units. 4-bedroom unit in new construction in the U.S. is almost unheard of unless it's like a luxury penthouse. And so really just a funny anecdote to this. When we were bike camping this weekend, we met this German couple who were biking to a national park a little bit south of where you guys are in Montana, from Seattle, retired. They had bought and lived in a Baugruppe in Berlin. It's a passive house. We spent like an hour just talking about all of the wonderful things that like living this way entails for them. They have a small unit. There's a guest suite, so any of their kids could come and stay in the building with them. When they run out of issues or when they run out of groceries, it's really easy to find someone to go get them. Like when they had COVID, they have regular meetings with all of their neighbors. The building is thin, and there's this larger courtyard that they can all kind of gather in. The kids play in it. It's a passive house, so the units themselves are much quieter. So even though they live on kind of a louder street, it's really relatively quiet in their building. And then they can open up to that courtyard, and it's lush, and there are lots of trees, and it's almost like living in nature. So I think that like there are ways that we could be developing our cities to really induce this way of living that feels like you're in a detached house, but is actually not radically, but it's actually very dense, and still lush, and imbued with nature and things like that.
So we really are trying to build better cities, more affordable, all that sort of stuff. So what's with these 15-minute city folks, Michael? They must be your best buds.
I'm a big proponent of the 15-minute cities. I always hear like so many issues like, oh, we don't want a 15-minute city because it requires you to ditch your car. It doesn't require, like, if you look at Paris, which is the Carlos Moreno, the guy who basically came up with the concept of the 15-minute city. Paris has seen radical transformations in the last 10 years, most of it under Anne Hidalgo. Their car ownership rate has dropped in half. There's bike infrastructure everywhere. They're cleaning up the city in terms of like air pollution. They're creating more space for people. It's quieter. The quality of life in a lot of ways is going up exponentially. But they're also doing a number of other things. They're utilizing that space that the cars used to be in for more blue-green infrastructure. So more ways to mitigate stormwater inundation. They also have a mandate for more social housing. So they have to have 30% of the housing in Paris by 2030 has to be social housing, affordable housing. So they're investing a lot of funds in affordable housing as well. It's really about, I think, developing this ecosystem where people can get by without a car. If they need a car, they don't have to use it for every little task. Like when I was a young parent, we had to drive. I had to drive my kid to daycare, drop them off at daycare because there wasn't one within walking distance to our house. Now we have an e-cargo bike, and we don't own a car, and it allows us to do a lot of the things that you would see in a 15-minute city. We can take our kids to sporting events, even though they're 6-7 miles away. We can drop our kids off at school without, making an unsafe condition for the other parents who are walking and biking their kids to school. We get our groceries by bike. Like it's really, I think, it's not even a radical change. It's just a change in the way that we're planning cities to be more in line with the way that we were building cities up until 120 years ago.
Great. Want to end with talking about one example that we've run across, and that is the city of Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain, in the Basque Country. They actually is the most interesting example I've seen of changing your whole approach to urban design. They had a 12-lane freeway that virtually carved right through the middle of Vitoria-Gasteiz, which is an 1,100-year-old city that's only about 7 kilometers across, I think, at its widest. You could literally walk the whole city anyways if you wanted to. But they got rid of the 12-lane road and replaced it with a 4-lane road with new street-level transit. I don't know if it's LRT or something like LRT. Giant pedestrian infrastructure, dual cycling infrastructure, and they even recreated an old stream like that had been paved over like many years ago right down the main street. And the interesting thing is they didn't do this. They were doing efforts like this around the city. Their mode shift is the numbers are spectacular. Like, people are walking, they're taking their bikes, they're taking transit. I think one of the biggest beneficiaries was cycling when they did that. And car use is down to 25% in Vitoria-Gasteiz. So Is that kind of the kind of thing we're talking about, like in just building a city that's more people friendly?
Definitely. So that's a really great example. When I was in college, I worked for a year in Freiburg, Germany. Freiburg is a very small city, 220,000 people or so, plus or minus. It bills itself as a city of short distances. There was a tram network that covered the entire city, the core of the city, which was really difficult to get around in by car anyway, because of narrow streets, was pedestrianized. But I think that the quality of life there was probably the highest I've ever lived. It's definitely the quietest place I've ever lived, even though I was in the heart of the city. But there are ways to retrofit cities to induce or allow, I think, a much better way of living, where you're not inundated by the traffic noise constantly, where you don't have to deal with where you site housing near air pollution because there's less cars, there's less pollution. Um, you in Seattle, we have this huge highway running north south in the middle of the city. And the state gave us some money to start to rethink what that approach would look like. Right now, it's generally 6 lanes of highway. Much of it doesn't even have sidewalk. It's not great to bike on. It's really difficult to walk on. And so when we think about like what are the models, I think Vittoria Gasteiz is like, look, you can is a great one. You can make space so that people who have cars can still get around by car. You can make it so that people who need transit can get around by transit. People who want to bike, walk. You can do all of these things. And so many of our streets, our right of ways are wide enough that you can accommodate a lot of this in a very narrow space. And the shift that comes with that, I think, entails just a much better way of living. The multifamily housing that we lived in Germany was on quiet streets, right? We don't do that in the US. We put all of our multifamily housing on these loud, toxic arterials. And so it's not just about quality of life. I think that's a big one, but like the public health implications of how we plan our buildings, where we put our buildings are massive. And I think that, until we start to think about, the long-term effects of that, we're not really going to start to change it. But the conversation is happening. I've been watching some of the conversation around infill housing in Edmonton for, I want to say it's been about a decade. I think it's been a couple of years. It's a conversation that needs to happen. It needs to be robust. I'm excited to hear what you guys are up to.
Well, I'll end with the folks in Vittoria Gasteiz. They said something, perhaps the most interesting comment I've ever heard in this context in terms of modes of transportation, that sort of thing. They said, we were interested in democratizing our investments in infrastructure. So, you don't hear it put that way very often, but the car rules. The car gets everything. Car drivers are entitled. Hate to say it, I'm a car driver too, but they're entitled. But what they called it there, where they actually created good infrastructure for all the modes, was a democratization of it, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
And similar conversations in Freiburg, it was very much about redemocratizing the street, making space for not just cars, but people, transit, bikes, having squares come off of streets so that you can sit at a cafe and talk to your friends and actually hear the conversation rather than having it, droned out by the noise of traffic. So I think that, the redemocratizing is it's a very apt way of putting it.
Although it's a cart and horse thing though too, isn't it? Because you invest, you get the more cyclists, and then you're democratic, or maybe you have a deficit to begin with. I don't know. It's a circular thing.
Yeah, I mean it's really difficult to get a wide reach on, especially mode share for cycling, if you don't have a safe, protected bike network. We're dealing with that in Seattle, where we don't really have a very well thought out protected bike network. Very little of it is actually protected, and so our mode share for cycling has been flat 3% for a decade, whereas the city of Freiburg has in 20 years has gone from like 10% to 40%. So it's possible. It's just it needs effort and a little bit of assistance.
I just did a story on the revolution of the e-bike. I was interviewing a guy. I picked the most average guy who just started cycling a year ago, who wound up buying an e-bike as the subject for the story. And he said something in the middle of the interview, which I hear all the time. Well, I have this e-bike, so I'm not getting much exercise, but it's blah, blah, blah. And I said, hold it. How much exercise were you getting before you bought the e-bike by cycling? Oh yeah, none. And actually the stats are you burn 444 calories per hour on an e-bike. You burn 555 on a regular bike. People who buy e-bikes statistically ride them 4 times further. So you're getting only 20% less exercise, but you're riding it 4 times further. So it's actually a net fitness benefit, which is I was interested to learn that.
We have cargo bikes. None of them up until 3 weeks ago were electric. We bought an electric cargo bike, and like I said, we don't own a car, but we've gone much further in those 3 weeks with our e-cargo bike than we ever did with our regular bikes. It's expanded the city. My wife's sister lives on kind of the opposite end of the city. Before we would have to take transit. It takes less time on the e-bike. It's quieter. It's much more enjoyable. The kid enjoys it. When we lived in Germany, in Bavaria, there's a big hill in our in kind of the outskirts of the city, and a lot of elderly residents live up there. They would e-bike down to the core of the city, the Altstadt, which is pedestrianized, pick up their daily groceries, meet friends for coffee or whatever they were doing, go to a doctor's appointment, and then just zoom right back up the mountain. Like, it opens up so much more of the city. It flattens the hills. It's magical. Like, it's unbelievable. For years, I was like, oh, I don't need an e-cargo. I don't need an e-bike. I'm young, I'm strong. And it's like, I'm getting older. My knees aren't as great. Kids are getting taller and bigger. And so, like, having that kind of accessibility it's magic. Like, it's completely changed the way we get around the city. We rely on transit less. We don't have to deal with car traffic to the extent that we would if we were driving. And so it's really wonderful. I do wish more people could, experience it so that they could maybe have that life-changing inspirational moment too.
Well, in terms of accessibility and the number of people that it allows to consider cycling, it broadens the whole thing pretty radically. I found the magical distance for me was 10 kilometers. I used to ride a regular bicycle 10 kilometers to work. And, there were many days when I thought, oh, I don't feel like the ride home at the end of the day. The one in the morning's great, but the end of the day. But when I switched to an e-bike, it was 20 below. And at 20 below, it was not a problem. Like, as the guy I just interviewed said, when all you got to do is dress right and your problem is overheating.
Yep. Yeah, the Viking biking. No, that's really incredible.
Okay, well, Michael, I think that's way too much, but it was fun. I look forward to seeing you come to Edmonton. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for working with my schedule. Sorry about that.
We'll see you up here in about a week.
Yep. Ciao.
I'd like to thank Michael Eliason for taking the time to talk to us about point access blocks and what better multifamily living could look like. We definitely need new solutions that are affordable, and there's a pressing need to reduce emissions. Please hit the subscribe button to get notified of our stories and check out our blog at GreenEnergyFutures.ca to see our previous 346 episodes on green buildings, clean transportation, and green energy. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.